Time for Behind the Wall this week. China's latest power play in Hong Kong. Stan Grant is here with us. Stan, last night, Hong Kong pro-democracy lawmakers resigned en masse after 4 of their colleagues were disqualified. Is that not a home goal, handing Beijing exactly what it wants?
Yeah, Bev, that's certainly the way it's being put, isn't it? I mean, if your job there is to hold the government to account, if your job there is to try to push for greater democracy, if your job is to give voice to people who believe in greater democracy, and of course we've seen the endless protests and the hundreds of thousands of people who have turned out, clearly there is a constituency there, then why walk away? You have to ask that question. Right now, as far as the Chinese Communist Party is concerned in Beijing, they run the show. They have everyone inside that chamber that they need to basically kowtow to whatever Beijing wants. So if you are a pro-democracy activist, you don't have a voice now inside that legislature. So to walk away from this is an enormous decision. At the same time, it reveals, and I think this is part of their strategy, Bev, is to reveal the fact that this idea of one country, two systems, that China would allow Hong Kong for 50 years after the handover in 1996 to continue to hold on to those things that made Hong Kong what it was, that British inheritance, that right to some degree of autonomy. Well, that's no longer the case. That essentially they're tearing up this one country, two systems agreement. But if you're Beijing, if you're Xi Jinping right now, you're looking at Hong Kong and saying, well, I have achieved exactly what I wanted.
Well, Stan, what did you make of the timing, given the world is distracted with the drama playing out after the US election?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to contemplate. And there has been a lot of speculation, Bev, around what would Beijing do? Would they use this period to actually try to achieve some of their agenda? Taiwan has been talked about as well. Will we see Xi Jinping try to press the advantage on Taiwan and push back against any independence sentiment there? And certainly when Beijing looks at Washington, they see right now chaos. They see a president in President Trump who refuses to concede. They see Joe Biden as president-elect waiting during this period of limbo. And if Beijing indeed wanted to exploit that, then certainly this would be the time to do it. I don't necessarily think that that's what we're seeing here right now. And I think that this is part of that ongoing campaign by Beijing to say, look, we control this. We will determine who sits in this legislature and who doesn't. We will determine who gets to have a voice, whether you can protest or not. So I think it's probably more to do with that ongoing agenda from Xi Jinping. But there is no doubt this feeds into that tension. It feeds into the great power rivalry between the United States and China, more broadly, the liberal democratic West and China. And if you are a pro-democracy activist in Hong Kong, surely you're asking yourself now as well, where are our champions? Where is the West? Where is the voice of the liberal democratic world standing up to support us?
And Stan, what does it mean for the future administration of Hong Kong?
You know, there's an old Chinese saying, and Xi Jinping certainly is aware of all of these sayings. He's schooled in Chinese philosophy and ideas and history. And it goes like this, Bev. It says that he who is assured of victory has no need to start a war. So if Xi Jinping, if the Communist Party felt that they were going to get their way, that they could wait the protesters out, that they could pass legislation to strangle the democracy movement, that they could disqualify democracy, pro-democracy politicians and then see the others walk out in support, well, they would sit there and say, we have won this and we haven't had to fire a shot, you know, to use that expression. So going forward, of course, we are going to see more control from Beijing. We've already seen this. We've seen that booksellers, for instance, have been locked up. There's pressure on the judiciary. There's pressure on journalists, on freedom of speech, on protest. We're going to see that. And as I said earlier, as far as most of the world is concerned, as far as Beijing is concerned to the rest of the world, this one country, two systems no longer holds. So when we're looking at Joe Biden now coming to the presidency, we've heard from Joe Biden in recent times ratcheting up the rhetoric, ratcheting up that pressure. We know as far as the United States is concerned, Democrat or Republican, they see China as a competitor. What do the next 4 years hold? Sean Montesso explains.
Joe Biden didn't mince his words in a Democratic primary debate earlier this year.
I spent more time with Xi Jinping than any world leader had by the time we left office. This is a guy who doesn't have a Democratic with a small d bone in his body.
With tensions between the US and China at an all-time high, eyes are turning to how America's next president might handle what will arguably be his greatest foreign policy challenge. For now, China is playing coy. Beijing is yet to acknowledge the president-elect, but that hasn't stopped state media from mocking President Trump's refusal to concede. Other state media has been speculating on what a Joe Biden presidency could mean. Joe Biden's first priority would likely be an end to Donald Trump's tit-for-tat trade war.
The United States has just announced tariffs on another $200 billion in Chinese-made goods.
Trump said he was determined to reduce America's $470 billion trade deficit with China, but it's actually grown during his time in office. Joe Biden has indicated he may change tack, with some close to the president-elect saying he'd consult with allies for collective leverage to end the dispute. But there are some differences between the US and China that won't change. Members of the US Congress have been vocal on human rights abuses in Xinjiang and the erosion of freedoms in Hong Kong. President Trump remained relatively quiet on these issues during his tenure, even being accused by some of exchanging silence over democracy in Hong Kong for a favourable trade deal. President-elect Biden and his administration could be even more vocal on defending human rights in China.
They must play by the rules. Period, period, period.
President Trump also pulled back from American alliances in the Asia-Pacific. It's likely Joe Biden would usher in a return to American leadership in the region, strengthening ties with traditional Asian allies like Japan and South Korea. So is there any room for common ground? China's pledge to be carbon neutral by 2060 stands in stark contrast to President Trump's decision to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord. But President-elect Joe Biden is committing America to carbon neutrality by 2050. So climate change could prove one area where the two could work together. But there is little else the US and China have in common. And the relationship between the world's two great powers will likely be one of rivalry and not cooperation.
So, what does the change in presidency mean for us and our biggest trading partner? Merriden Varrall is the director of the Australia Geopolitics Hub at KPMG, and she joins me now from Sydney. Good to have you with us, Merriden. I wanted to start just with the fact that Xi Jinping has not yet congratulated Joe Biden. Do you read anything more into it than it's just a matter of timing?
It's hard to say exactly what Xi Jinping is thinking, I have to admit, but I would say that they are waiting for the democratic process to take its full course and to be concluded officially before they're going to get involved with congratulating any party.
How did you feel when, during the debate, we heard, and he said this before, in fact, Joe Biden refer to Xi Jinping as a thug? When I heard that, I have to say, there's a bit of an intake of breath, and I thought, well, how is this going to be received in China by Xi Jinping himself? What did you think of that?
I think that to some degree, the Chinese government, the Chinese officials expect that there is going to be anti-Chinese rhetoric in American political campaigns. It's fairly standard. However, of course, that kind of language is not particularly conducive to a functioning relationship. And it's unfortunate, I think, that we see that kind of language in the political domain.
Now, for those people who may be expecting a different line on China from a Biden administration, it is a fact, isn't it, Merriden? And when it comes to China and how the US sees China, it is a relationship that's framed around competition. There's bipartisanship on that, isn't it? Republican and Democrat.
Yeah, you're right about that. So I think there's, we've talked a lot in the press and in various different narratives about the differences in foreign policy between Biden and Trump. And we know, or we expect, for example, that Biden has a more values-based understanding of what the international order should look like. He has a more normative appreciation, values-driven. And that's really based on an idea that America and its allies should be making the rules for the order. And of course, we've heard that Biden's going to be more stable and predictable, using the established processes to engage in foreign policy. And we've understood that another difference with Trump is that there's a much more of an approach that is multilateral, drawing on networks, building alliances. But as you rightly point out, this does not equal a reset, because there are two fundamental things that are still continuing from Trump. And that will be, firstly, that foreign policy is going to be about America, first of all. And secondly, exactly as you say, that this kind of hawkish sentiment on China is absolutely, it's almost a consensus from left to right, from top to bottom in the policy and political domains in the US now.
I want to come to Australia and how Australia navigates this, but just one more question directly relating to the US and China. What do the Chinese fear more? The predictability and alliance building of a Joe Biden, or the unpredictability that they've dealt with Donald Trump? On the one hand, Donald Trump talked up his friendship with Xi Jinping. They end up in a trade war. Do the Chinese, would they rather actually deal with a predictable administration? Does unpredictability bother them more?
It's really hard to say, and you'll get different perspectives on this depending on who you talk to. But certainly some Chinese academics and commentators have talked about how at first they were really worried about Trump, but over time, because of that unpredictability, they felt that unpredictability was not ideal, but that Trump didn't have a particularly values-based vision of the international order was something that they in fact preferred. So there's various different perspectives to take on that question.
Now, Australia, what does Australia do to navigate this? Because we know this great power rivalry is only going to increase. As you've pointed out, there's bipartisanship on this. The worst scenarios have a conflict between the US and China, and Australia certainly is preparing for greater instability. But we know we've paid a price already for criticising China when it comes to some of our trade and some of the bans that have been put on aspects of our trade. So what does Australia do for the next 4 years?
We've been talking about this in Australia for years now. What does Australia do when our two major these two global powers with whom we have our strategic alliance and with whom we have a very strong trading relationship are not getting along? And people have talked about, trying to ride two horses as the two horses are diverging. Obviously, it's an incredibly sensitive situation. And I think while a Biden presidency may take some of the heat out, some of that kind of propensity for flaring up, the fundamentals are still going to be there, and that tension is going to continue, that strategic competition is going to continue. So for Australia, this means that we cannot do anything except be more sensitive, be more sophisticated. And we have to also consider where we are in the region. This is not just about the US and China. This is about Asia as well. And our Asian neighbours don't want to see this US-China strategic competition. They don't want to see the region being a strategic theatre for competition. They want to see inclusivity, they want to see peace, they want to see stability. And Australia has to consider that as well as our broader interests.
So just taking all that into mind, how important are organisations like ASEAN going to be? How important is something like the Quad, Australia, Japan, India and the United States? How important are they going to be? And how do you get the messaging right on this when China looks at some of that alliance building and thinks that the countries in the region and the US are ganging up on China?
And that's a particularly pertinent point, because China, as we've seen on many occasions in the past, really sees those kinds of network activities or alliances or cooperations. They see that, they take it very personally, and they react quite defensively to it. And it fits very well into their existing narrative that, the weakness that China's suffered since the late 1800s through the 1900s, what they call the century of humiliation. This victimization narrative, this bullying narrative that those Western and allied powers deliberately pulled China apart in the Opium Wars in the 1800s, and that is their agenda still today. So when China sees or feels that it's being encircled or that others are working together against it, its response is very defensive, and we see that in the language that it uses when it talks about being bullied and persecuted. It doesn't create the result that to change its approach.
Merriden Varrall, Merriden, good to have you on the program. Thank you again for giving us your time.
Thanks, Dan.